I have never considered myself right wing. And I think that one of the things that comes across very clearly, in particular in the two novels that you're interested in, both Faustian Futurist and Uberman, is that my thought is at least as far to the left as it's legitimately describable as anything right wing. And in particular, I'd refer you to the huge role that the Soviet Union and the Soviet world mission play in both of these quote unquote novels. From my inception as a serious thinker, I would say in my master's years, when I began to develop a lot of the ideas that are in the anthology of essays published as Lovers of Sophia, I already had a political vision that could not be reduced to any existing category or extant ideology. So, I mean, there are people who brand themselves as philosophers, but they utterly lack any political dimension to their thinking. And I've gone on record saying that I don't think such a person can be legitimately classed as a philosopher. And there's a very intrinsic reason for this. It's because it's the task of the philosopher to question everything from a fundamental level and to destabilize control systems and entrenched dogmas and ideologies that are preventing the unfolding of thought across society and the expansion of consciousness. And so if you're not challenging extant structures in a political dimension as well as in a scientific dimension, then you are falling short of the task of a philosopher. So therefore, as someone who's seriously been pursuing a philosophical life, my thought has always had a political dimension to it. But if you go back and read some of these essays in Lovers of Sophia, which, as I said, they go back to my master's years before I even developed Prometheus and Atlas. Exactly. You can see that my political thought does not fit into any category. And so in the wake of Prometheus and Atlas, which was written in 2011, 2012, the challenge for me became how to pragmatically approach building a concrete political project in the world that would do some level of justice to my overarching philosophical project. What would be the points of insertion? What would be the existing structures that I could work with in some way, that I could quite frankly manipulate in various ways in order to advance my own philosophical project? And in part, that was determined not solely by myself, but by opportunities that presented themselves to me. And only in hindsight did I realize that the principal people who put themselves forward to try to, solicit some kind of concrete political project from me were actually party to an intelligence operation. I mean, actually, it was quite clear to me up front that they were involved in the intelligence community, but instead of soliciting me to be involved in an intelligence operation, which I thought is what was going on, it turned out in retrospect that I realized I was the target of the intelligence operation. And so if you read, for example, my book World State of Emergency from 2017, the conceptual analysis of the problems with liberal democracy in there on the basis of, let's say, Carl Schmitt, and the formulation of the idea of the need for a world state by pushing back against Carl Schmitt's critique of why there can't be a world state and developing certain notions of his from Theory of the Partisan about, advanced technology and how it forces us to call into question the concept of the political that he had originally developed in the 20s and 30s. All of that analysis is legitimate in the sense that, I stand behind its the clarity of its argumentation and the lines of reasoning, that are being unfolded there. And I do reject liberal democracy as well as the United Nations international system, which, by the way, I wrote a master's thesis on, the UN international system and the problem of Islamic democracy. So all of those lines of argumentation are legitimate and I stand behind them. But the concrete political project that was proposed toward the end of World State of Emergency was quite frankly part of an intelligence operation. And it was very clearly designed for a definite purpose, which was to interlink the Iranian Renaissance, which I was working with closely at that time. I was working, frankly, at the highest level of the Iranian Renaissance. I mean, practically Shahin Nejad, the leader of the movement, was like a family member to me. Okay, so I was deep in the inner circle at the highest level of that movement. And they had a great interest in aligning themselves with the people around Trump at that time, of course, for the sake of pushing their own agenda of toppling the Islamic Republic of Iran. And Steve Bannon was known to be a reader of Arctos books, and so he was considered to be an angle of approach that we could use to reach Trump on Iran policy. And so I was using this willingness of the Iranian Renaissance to be involved with the American right in order to then create a fusion between the Iranian Renaissance and the emerging alt-right at the time, for the purpose of shifting the politics of the alt-right away from white nationalism and towards some kind of occulted cosmopolitan perspective that would be framed in terms of the discourse of an Indo-European world order. And if you actually look at, what I'm proposing in there in terms of India and Japan, I mean, the Japanese are, not even remotely European in their ethnicity. India and Japan and the wider Buddhist world being connected through Iran to Europe and Russia and America. This is essentially a cosmopolitan world order, but I'm framing it in terms of a discourse of civilizational identity or intercivilizational identity in order to deconstruct the, at that time, very nascent embryonic white nationalist discourse, and push the alt-right away from that. That was the project that I was told I was participating in. Later, it turned out that actually I was the target of this intelligence operation myself, and the point was to muddy me with it, through association with the likes of Richard Spencer. They're a vehicle for introducing my philosophical ideas in the medium of fiction, which allows for these ideas to directly penetrate the subconscious of the reader. That's one sentence, comma in between. Second sentence, they are also semi-autobiographical in a way that is intended both to reveal my deepest motivations to a discerning reader, and also to act as a testament in case anything should happen that prematurely ended my philosophical career. And then finally, third sentence, they are an implementation of my concept of novel folklore, or the deliberate re-engineering of society on the folkloric level of the collective unconscious. I had a more long-term marketing strategy in view, where I wanted to get these books out, and Arctos was a venue that was practical and efficient for that in the near term. But I believed for certain reasons that actually, I think in retrospect, I had good reason to believe there are certain developments taking place right now behind the scenes, that these books would wind up reaching a much wider audience through certain means, like, for example, let's say hypothetically graphic novel adaptation, and then perhaps from there film adaptation. And so ultimately the audience was definitely not limited to anything like the Arctos audience. In fact, the demographic that I was aiming at would be people who are interested in, the films of David Lynch, David Cronenberg, Ridley Scott. That was more the kind of audience that I was aiming at. People interested in the writings of Philip K. Dick. Maybe there'd be a little bit of overlap with the Arctos folks in the sense that there are Lovecraftian people in the Arctos community, and also obviously much more extensively outside of it. So that was the kind of demographic that I was aiming at, attempting to bring them in through their aesthetic orientation, bring them into the philosophy of Prometheism. And then also, to be honest with you, the two other demographics that I was aiming at, I wouldn't call them demographics, audiences, was people in the intelligence community who would understand certain things that would be lost on maybe the average reader, and then finally also people who are part of what I've referred to as the breakaway civilization. In other words, there are parts of these novels where I'm speaking across a normal audience, and I'm speaking to people who will understand things that are being said in an esoteric fashion, trying to deliver a certain message to them. Again, it goes back to the concept of novel folklore. If you notice, the works that I engage with in particular are folkloric in character. They're not just any popular culture. They're the kinds of popular cultural narratives that have a mythic force, and they are acting to transform the lore of the folk on a archetypal subconscious level. And so I'm working with those symbols and images in order to appropriate them, and in order to also, insinuate my own ideas into the narrative that's being developed, into the kind of super story, the story of stories that's being unfolded by these various creators in our time, which I think ultimately, in its essence, is a Promethean story. I wrote both Faustian Futurist and Uberman very quickly. And, I mean, by comparison to, let's say, Prometheus and Atlas, or Iranian Leviathan, both Prometheus and Atlas and Iranian Leviathan are meticulously well-researched texts that, have lots of citations, and they took a long time to compose. Faustian Futurist and Uberman, it was like a storm. And it's partly because it involves a process of opening the gates between the subconscious mind and the conscious mind, and being able to basically filter and shape and channel contents from my subconscious. But because those are there, it flows very quickly. And yeah, I had outlines, revised outlines, but it was a very free-flowing process. And I certainly wasn't sitting there agonizing about what to write. The stories wrote themselves through me in large part. So I guess maybe that is responsive. Oh, but comparison to my academic writing. An important point, though, is that actually this process is not as different from how I compose my academic works as one might think, because something about my academic writing is that, or academic, whatever you want to call it, I don't know if academic is really the right term, more rigorous nonfiction writings, okay, is that the way that I compose them is actually very much the way an artist paints. I don't necessarily write them in sequential order, and I'll sometimes work on one part of it and go back and work more on another part of it, and it's like having a canvas in front of you where you elaborate in greater detail after putting down broad brush strokes in various places of the canvas. So I've always worked in that kind of manner of an artist, despite the technical rigor of some of these texts. And Selwyn Griffith, well, so no, I didn't solicit feedback from him in terms of writing these pieces, but what I did mention in one of the interviews, which is true, is that Selwyn was aware of both extensive autobiographical parts of what became these stories many years ago, before I even published Prometheus and Atlas, and he was also aware of ideas that I had for developing a kind of narrative, a story, that would basically stitch these fragments together and, make a fiction from out of them. So I had the idea for Faustian Futurist even before Prometheus and Atlas, but as a vague notion in the back of my mind. And those are things that I did share with Selwyn, beginning in around 2015 or so. Yeah, well, they're dangerous books. I mean, okay, let me put it to you this way. There are a couple of people who I'm not going to mention any names, all right? But there are a couple of people who, in fact, were both in the right wing community, who were closely associated with me and quite intelligent. And I was trying to work on some projects with them. And they read Faustian Futurist and basically lost their minds. I mean, it drove them insane. And they both embraced some form of fundamentalist Christianity. One of them became a Catholic, or what do they call these people? The Catholics who reject Vatican II, traditionalist Catholic, basically, one of them, and the other one became a Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, and they were both, open to Prometheism. They were both fairly complex, let's say, intellectually sophisticated, and okay, it drove them insane. They reached for some kind of a fundamentalist life raft because of where this book put them. And so if that's the effect it has on such people, then imagine being the person who writes it. Okay, so, it's an experience of... there's a Dionysian... so, some people might read these books and they might think that they're very narcissistic, that they're very egocentric, and so on and so forth, for various reasons. I can easily imagine how some people might have the superficial impression that these are, narcissistic works, or that they reveal some kind of narcissism. But the reality is, and someone who has an understanding of the history of aesthetics will grasp this, the reality is that to write books like Faustian Futurist and Uberman, you have to be able to transcend your ego. And so there is a kind of Dionysian overcoming of the ego and willingness to sacrifice oneself in the sense of the constructs that one wants to identify with oneself. The safety net of personal identifications and, constructs that basically fortify a certain persona. And you have to let all of that go in order to write books like this, and open yourself up to also, people are going to be reading this, and especially if you're someone who has a lot of enemies like I am, you're opening yourself up potentially to self-destruction by writing books like this. So yeah, that's an interesting state to be in. It by itself is a kind of spiritual initiatic experience. Sadeh Hedayat was a huge influence on me. I mean, because, I read and reread The Blind Owl, both in English and in Persian, and you can see the first-person narrative style of these books is very much in line with how he writes, and also the surrealism and the writing from out of the unconscious. So that's one influence. And then, yeah, Kafka must be a deep influence on me, whether I'm conscious of it or not, because I was so deeply immersed in his writing for a certain period of time. Then, yes, Hesse, I would say Hermann Hesse is another, and then definitely some Philip K. Dick. Yeah, so those would be probably the main literary influences. And then, in terms of okay, so the books within the books, Kierkegaard used to assume these personas in order to write philosophical works, not in his own voice. And then this is, of course, modeled to an extent on what Plato did in his dialogues, where Plato had these... Plato wanted to be a playwright initially. He wanted to be a tragedian. And when he met Socrates, he burned all his plays. So we don't have any of the plays that were written by Plato. But this style that he adopts of sometimes making philosophical arguments in voices other than the voice of Socrates, and sometimes in certain dialogues it is Plato speaking through these other characters, not through Socrates, where he's playing with the idea of assuming dramatic personae for engaging in philosophical dialectics. And to an extent, that's what I'm doing here, because, so I'll often come up with ideas for philosophical books that I never write, like outlines and so on and so forth. And so this was also a way to dialectically explore opposed philosophical positions by, drafting works in the context of this book that can be participants in a philosophical dialectic, right? Where I'm not investing entirely in the claims being forwarded in the context of that fictional book within the book, but I'm using that position in order to advance a certain dialectic. And then also one other thing about that, it's a question of intertextuality as well. It's a question of it almost suggests that we're living inside of a text ourselves. That, there are these texts within this text, and then this text exists maybe in a larger text, which is the one that we're inside of now. And, the world is all, well, it's a structure of logos, a nested hierarchy of interpenetrating narratives, which is a very Kabbalistic view of the world in a sense. To be honest with you, none. I don't think I've been influenced by a single person who was published at Arctos. The closest thing, which I've commented on before, is that I wanted to coin this term archaeofuturism, and which is how I found Arctos in the first. I wanted to coin this term, and I Googled it, and basically Guillaume Fay came up, and I was pissed off because I wanted to coin this term, and then once I have to be perfectly honest with you, I really haven't read much of Guillaume Fay because I kind of delved into it, and I was even more pissed off then because I saw that he was using this term archaeofuturism in a completely superficial fashion, basically just slapping some technology on top of medieval racist feudalism, and so I was not interested to waste more of my time going down that hole. And other than that, no. I mean, Alexander Dugin, who I feel very bad for him, what just happened to him in terms of his daughter, but he's been a little bit of I suppose, antagonist in that, I guess. But, to be honest with you, I can't even say that I've been negatively influenced by Dugin, because my arguments against Dugin's position I already had developed as arguments against Samuel Huntington, or critical appropriations of Samuel Huntington. So, and I don't see a fundamental difference between Dugin's multipolar vision and what Samuel Huntington was already arguing in the 1990s. Dugin is basically misappropriated, unimaginative Heideggerianism mixed with Samuel Huntington's civilizational politics. And so, yeah, that's not something that's going to be deep enough to influence me. It actually was accepted for publication at a press called Anomalist Books, which publishes Jacques Vallée. So, I mean, that's a fairly substantive, author, Jacques Vallée, and they accepted it for publication. And to be honest with you, and the editor had already edited most of the manuscript, and I pulled it from that press, and I actually paid the editor for the work that he had done, and I went with Arctos. And now, again, I had found Arctos because I Googled Guillaume Fay, and I looked through their book list, and there was a range of things that they published, from Schelling type metaphysics to Indo-European civilizational identity, which I found it interesting. They published some Hindu stuff, some Iranian associated stuff, and they had this general Indo-European vision. So I saw possibilities there that I could maybe, beyond just this book, go on to explore Iranian civilizational ideas that I had and have this be my publisher. So there was that appeal. And then, of course, there was the nascent alt-right at that time, and the people around Trump, and there was a certain political atmosphere which I saw Arctos having a reach into demographically. But to be perfectly honest with you, and maybe this is not the answer you want, but it certainly fits with what's in Faustian Futurist and Uberman. It was based on a psychic intuition that I did this. And I thought a lot about it, and it was one of the most agonizing decisions I ever made in my life. Because I saw that if I published this book with Arctos, it would be like sending up a flare. And certain people would see it, who would then bring me into something that would be of great consequence for the rest of my career. And the other image that I got was that publishing this book at Arctos was like going up to the huge doors of a mansion, like huge, like oak wood doors of some mansion, like Tom Cruise at the beginning of, in Eyes Wide Shut, right? Going up to that house on Long Island where there's this gathering and knocking on the door. The submitting of this book to Arctos for publication was the knocking on that door. And that if that door were to open, then, the rest is history. That this was going to be decisive for my future. And now I didn't get the impression decisive in a good way, decisive in a bad way. It was just that, okay, look, if you go with this anomalous press, whatever, this could be a successful book, might be some people, academic, whatever, people interested in it, good for the parapsychology community, etc. But if you go with Arctos, this is going to change your life. And I decided to go with Arctos. So it was kind of like an opening of Pandora's box. I felt that, and I let myself do it. Okay, so Faustian Futurist. Faustian Futurist, we could say the protagonist is a reincarnation of Nikola Tesla, who winds up getting involved with the intelligence community and discovering some very disturbing things about his own traumatic past, and penetrating an occulted fascist breakaway civilization, which he aims to defeat, but which strangles him slowly like a boa constrictor. So that would be Faustian Futurist. And then Uberman, well, it's a future incarnation of the same protagonist who is living in a world where traditionalism has basically consolidated control over almost all of the earth. And she is leading a resistance movement against that. But in the face of imminent defeat, she decides to send a team of time travelers, ultimately to be led by herself, back to the 1980s, which is the last juncture that she's determined human history can be set in a different direction, and specifically by preventing the fall of the Soviet Union, so that the Soviet Union can act together with the United States as the left hand of a Prometheus that crushes this attempted fascist takeover of the planet. Wonder would be one of them. There's a whole chapter called Wonder Wheel in Faustian Futurist. Terror. And inspiration. And again, I didn't really deep dive into his work, okay? But from what I understand, there are some huge differences. Phi basically, and again, I could be wrong here, but it seems to me that what Phi is proposing is that white people and this is the discourse that he uses, which is frankly from a European perspective retarded. But white people should create a super state reaching basically from Gibraltar to, the Siberian border with Alaska, and then maybe through there into North America, right? And so you create this white super state, and in this white super state, advanced technology is going to be used to make our lives convenient in all kinds of ways. So he has a kind of a little bit of a Jetsons embrace of the promise of advanced technology for making our lives more comfortable. But even within this white super state, there's going to be a kind of, let's say, neo-feudal structure with large-scale agriculture and basically like a peasant population. Granted, they'll be using mechanized farming and various technologies to make things more efficient, but you still have the basic structures of a kind of medieval feudal agrarian system even within the white world. And then, as I understand it, he thinks basically non-white people should be left to stagnate, that white disinvestment in the rest of the world would allow these populations to collapse into a pre-industrial state and basically devour each other to their heart's content. And so there's a somewhat breakaway sense there where there's going to be this dissociation of the white world from the rest of the planet, but that's not nearly at the level of what defines a breakaway civilization as I understand it. And then a breakaway civilization as I understand it is not neo-agrarian, neo-feudal. They're a super technological elite, basically Olympian gods or devas, who are then ruling over an entirely deindustrialized agrarian neo-feudal planet. Okay, which would include ignorant white people as well as certain other races. And so I think these are significantly different. And I didn't get my idea of a neo-agrarian, neo-feudal state from Guillaume Faye at all. I got it from what I see, looming in our not too distant future. What Ben's problem is. Listen, I sat down with that guy 2 or 3 different times, in person to be interviewed by him, and I made it perfectly clear to him that I'm not a traditionalist. And he said a number of things in there about me. Look, I have been the subject of such trash journalism, of pieces that are so far from the truth and just utterly warped that by comparison, Ben Teitelbaum did a pretty good job. But that's a low bar. And so there are some things that Ben says about me that, he should have known better given what I said to him in the interviews that we had. And so, no, I never told him I was a traditionalist. And also, I didn't present myself as a Zoroastrian, and somehow he's got this narrative that, like, I'm a Zoroastrian or something. No. The fact is that cultural identities are historical subjects, religious groupings are historical subjects, they overlap with and intersect cultural identities in various ways. They're not necessarily coextensive. They are overlapping in certain ways. Like, for example, Russian culture and Orthodoxy. I mean, not everyone in Orthodoxy is Russian, but there's a significant overlap between Russian culture as a let's say, ethno-linguistic structure, and then Orthodoxy as a religious belief. Okay, they're not isometric, but there's overlap. And this is true in many cases. Islam and the Arabs, again, largely overlapping, but definitely not isomorphic. And then there's racial groupings. I think that's a legitimate, historical subject as well. I wouldn't reject that races are historical subjects. I would reject a future based on racial identity. But as a matter of fact in history, it's played a huge role. I mean, especially in the United States. So, I mean, the black race in the United States is definitely a historical subject. So, yeah, these are all different interpenetrating, overlapping types of historical subject that feature in my work. Well, listen, the context is important. You're talking about where Nick Griffin Nikolai Alexandrov adopts this name Nick Griffin, and he writes this text, Faustian Futurism, which is the book within the book, which he's pitching at Harold Keith Thompson, who's the leader of a underground fascist cell in New York City. And so Nikolai wants to penetrate this organization So he develops a discourse which he thinks is going to be acceptable and basically ingratiate himself to this esoteric group. And in that context, he basically makes a racial argument for the achievement of, quote, Faustian civilization, unquote, with reference to Spengler and Yaki. And in fact, he finds Yaki by following Thompson into a certain bookstore and seeing that Thompson picks out a copy of Imperium. And so he's figuring out how he would, what angle of approach he would take to penetrate this operation. That's the context for that. So, okay, I think there are three things that can be said in response to that. Three different dimensions of this, and three different maybe aims or objectives of writing, in that way. And they're related. So one is that it's a Tantric methodology that, if you read, let's say, the essay Serpent Power of the Superman in Lovers of Sophia, or certain parts of novel folklore where I'm engaging with Shaktiism, with Kashmiri Shiavite Tantrism, in interpreting the Blind Owl, you can see that there is a strong Tantric current in my work. And this is one of the ways in which I'm reaching into the East philosophically. So the subversion of taboos and the deconstructive effect that it has on consciousness, on our construction of our own ego and so forth, that is one of the aims of Tantra, to catalyze spiritual growth through deconstruction of the self by dismantling certain taboos that the persona is invested in. And so on one level, those scenes in both books are a Tantric methodology. And then connected to that, those scenes, look, either a reader will put the book down at that point, and I'm sure many have, right? There are people who they get to something like that, and that's it. They're not going to go any further. They're going to throw the book out or throw it across the room or whatever. Or they'll persist out of whatever morbid curiosity. And you see, what happens there is that the scenes are they're such a violation that at that point the reader has to open the barrier that usually shields his conscious mind from his subconscious. And the reader then has to open his subconscious mind to what I'm writing. And so these scenes act as a way to lower the defenses of the reader and allow for the ideas in the text to be inserted directly into the subconscious of the reader. Those are two dimensions or motivations. And then the third is connected to both of them, which is, okay, why do I want to get into the subconscious of the reader, right? Why am I aiming for this kind of tantric deconstruction through the subversion of taboos and so on and so forth? It's because I'm trying to catalyze a certain kind of conception, a certain gestation of a post-human form of life. And so the sexual imagery in these books is also the imagery of the conception of the breeding of a post-human form of life. That it's going to hatch from out of the minds of the people who have let this into their subconscious and allowed it to do the work of deconstruction on them. A number of reasons. I mean, first of all, it's not lost on anybody who's read my whole corpus and is aware of the Iranian, aspects of my thinking, that Dana is a core concept in Zoroastrianism. It means, inner conscience or inner knowing, basically similar to the anima and connected etymologically to dianoia in Greek and so on and so forth. And so Dana Avalon is my Dana on one level, symbolically. And on another level, it involves the Mithraic initiation into the second degree which is the degree of the nymphos, where the initiate, basically, the Mithraic initiate was forced to become a transvestite in the second degree of initiation in Mithraism. And so there's an initiatic dimension to it that has to do with, again, breaking one's self-image and allowing for a reconstruction of consciousness and for a certain kind of spiritual receptivity. So there's that. In other words, there's a Zoroastrian meaning to it. There's a Mithraic meaning to it. And then, I thought that in line very much with, frankly, the feminism that's present throughout my works, which the people on the right hate me for, that it would be good to have a female protagonist, a strong female protagonist. And why not, And one of the points that I make in Uberman is that I think I'm a person who across, I take Ian Stevenson's empirical research on reincarnation very seriously. I think he did decades of rigorous empirical work studying cases of, children's spontaneous memories of past lives. And so I don't accept anything that any intuition or impression that I have unless it aligns with some empirical evidence. But given that it aligns with certain empirical evidence, the impressions that I've had of certain past lives that I've lived lead me to believe that I predominantly have been male throughout many of my past lives. More so probably than, a lot of people. And so I thought this is a kind of good antidote to that if I were to come back next time, I would probably come back as a woman, because, especially for someone who wants to advance the cause of and position of women in the world, it's enough already being constantly reincarnated as a man. So I figured, why not? The polarity between male and female is necessary in order to define dialectically a third term that would be beyond them. So it's a kind of Hegelian dialectic that if we are to retrieve this primordial androgyny, but in a conscious way and on a higher level, then it has to be done in terms of a dialectic between the male and the female. So my vision, which I've been quite forthright about, of using singularity level technologies, right? Methodologies of transhumanism, in order to concretely embody a kind of alchemical androgyny and create a sort of hermaphroditic third sex. This only makes sense in terms of the dichotomy between male and female. It transcends it, it overcomes it, but it only has a positive significance with respect to these two terms. And so I'm not by any means proposing, as a lot of hysterical people on the right may believe, that we get rid of men and women. Not at all. I'm saying that in a future human society, on the other side of technological singularity and on the other side of what I call the spectral revolution, and I think, again, this has everything to do with the spectral. In other words, transsexuality or the transgender or whatever has everything to do with the nature of the spectral. It's a specter. That on the other side of the spectral revolution, there will be more than these two sexes. There will be probably a third sex that embodies concretely this specter of the androgen that the alchemists were on about in the Renaissance period, and that you see Plato, talking about in his dialogues in Symposium, when he talks about the primordial age when, humans were still sexually undifferentiated, and then, even the myth of Prometheus. Pandora is given to Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus, as a retaliatory move by Zeus against Prometheus. And when Pandora is accepted by Epimetheus, she's the first woman. So the race that was created by Prometheus was this sexually undifferentiated androgynous humanity. Humanity version 1.0. The first men were not men. They were, as Plato says in Symposium, a race of androgens. So this idea has been there in the West from the beginning, and of course it aligns with certain other ideas in India about androgyny, of Shiva, Ardhanari, and so on and so forth.